In this video, we review the methodology you should use when analyzing a data-based study. For every study based on data collection, every news report involving data, you should start by identifying the individuals, the people, animals, or things for which we collected data, and whether those individuals are the entire target population or just a sample representative of that population. You should make sure that you have identified every variable reported in the study and whether each one is quantitative or categorical. You should figure out whether the study is observational or experimental, and then define the kind of design the study used. You should also make sure that you have clearly identified the study's main objectives, as well as, if they are provided, the conclusions that were reached. Make yourself a mental checklist where for each new report, each new study, you make sure to identify the individuals, the variables, the design, the objectives, and conclusions. We should always start by identifying the individuals in the study because the conclusions from the study will apply only to those individuals or individuals like them. Understand that the individuals are the statistical units on which data is collected, which is not the same as the groups of individuals for which summary data are reported. The variables are the features that are recorded for each individual. This is different from the summary statistics or parameters that may also be provided in the report. Confusing the individuals and the groups, confusing the variables with their summaries are very common mistakes that can lead you to completely misunderstanding the study or doing the completely wrong analysis. The best way to determine whether a variable is quantitative or categorical is to think of one individual in the study and ask yourself whether a meaningful number was recorded, which would correspond to a quantitative variable, or whether a statement, some attribute of some sort, was recorded, which would correspond to a categorical variable. Most studies record data on several variables, so identify every single variable that is reported on. You should make sure you understand whether you have an observational study or an experiment. If you find that the differences between the subjects occurred on their own, then you have an observational study. Whereas if the conditions were imposed specifically to see if they affect the response variable, then you have an experiment. Always ask how many groups were compared and how they were selected, or if conditions were imposed, ask how many conditions and how were they imposed. Those questions will help you figure out the details of the specific design of your study, and they will typically relate to the study's objective. The distinction between observational studies and experimental studies is very important because the issues for both types of studies and the kind of conclusions we can make based on data collected in these two settings are substantially different. In an observational study, countless confounding variables may limit the scope of our conclusions, and concluding about causation can be very difficult on the basis of just one observational study. Observational studies are typically fairly realistic because we record data in a natural environment. In an experimental study, on the other hand, we might force some influential factors to be the same for everyone so that they wouldn't have an influence in the context of that experiment. The individuals are typically assigned at random to those different conditions, which means that the conditions are not associated with potentially confounding variables, which makes causation a lot easier to conclude in most experimental settings. Experimental settings can be simplistic and unrealistic, which means that the conclusions we can draw from them could be very limited in scope.